And so you actually couch your juridical approach then in the backdrop of human rights, which is common parlance in women's rights considerations, right? Women's
Yes.
rights is a matter of human rights so that it
Yes.
falls under that universal scope. Women are human
Yes.
too.
Yes.
But what does that mean? Why is it an important place for us to begin the discussion that women's rights are human rights? And maybe talk to
Yeah, I
us a
think
little
that's
bit about that universal declaration that was made.
yeah, I think that's a great question. Talking about women's rights is not really a new issue, but if we're going to have some kind of framework for having an intelligent conversation about it, I think it helps to be able to think about it in terms of human rights, because human rights, we can, at least in more recent history, take a look at what happened with the United Nations forming after World War II Nazi Germany. It formed because the nations wanted to come together and say, we don't want this to happen anymore. This was an atrocity. The Holocaust, what happened in World War II Nazi Germany, this was awful. We don't want, well, let's understand what happened so that we can avoid this. And so out of the United Nations, especially the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, we see this idea that human rights are important for everyone. It's something that we're born with, and that there is a higher law that is above man-made law. Now, why is that important? Well, if you take a look at the Nuremberg trial, one of the defenses that many of the Nazi soldiers were using as they were accused of committing terrible atrocities is they said we were following the law, that the law in our country,
Right.
which was a good argument. But unless you look at, there's a law that is above the law, and that is a higher law, that is God's law or divine law or an objective moral law that is outside of ourselves. So I decided to use the framework that was established by the United Nations originally. That's not to say that we follow it necessarily, that the UN is necessarily following it that closely anymore today. But at its founding, it was really looking at human rights from the perspective of universality. The human rights are universal. That they're inherent, the inherency. It's inherent in all of us. It's something we're born with. We don't earn it. We don't deserve it. And that there is a higher law that we answer to. So I use that as kind of the framework, really then focusing on that third aspect, the higher law. What is the law that we're going to follow if we're going to try to identify human rights, and specifically for my paper, women's rights?
Yeah, we used to have a lot of buzz around the idea that you can't legislate morality, right? When you think of it,
use that.
I
used to use that when I was a feminist and pro-choice. I used that. I said we can't legislate morality.
My
but
body,
you and
my
I know,
choice.
We legislate morality all the time.
Yeah,
every law has some moral basis.
Every law is someone's conception of the good, so that when someone legislates, it's not that it comes from a vacuum. There's a set of assumptions. There's a worldview. There's a value system that people bring to the table when they are legislating for the public good, and that's what it is.
That's right.
And it's interesting, even with that 1948 declaration, one of the senior architects in that product was Charles Malik, and Charles Malik, of course, was trained at Harvard as a philosopher, as a Christian philosopher. I think he was Eastern Orthodox, but he came to that project with that set of assumptions, just like in the United States Declaration of Independence and our founding documents. If you've got a social contract out there, even if it's not, representative exactly from maybe a predominant religion in the neighborhood, there are clues, there are traces. It's inescapable because legislation doesn't happen in a vacuum.